Hi, I'm Professor Brian Lowery, and this is Leadership for Society, the Daring Dialogue course. I'm at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and this quarter we're tackling challenges of leading in divisive times. And today I'm excited to talk to Ambassador Nicholas Burns about leadership as a veteran American diplomat. Ambassador Burns has served in Democratic and Republican administrations, specifically, Reagan, Clinton, Bush, and most recently the Biden administration. Ambassador Burns, Nick, welcome.
Professor Brian, thank you very much. Great to be with you. And it's freezing here in Cambridge, Mass. It's probably not freezing in Palo Alto, California. So it's nice to be with you.
Thanks for taking the time. So can you just give us, I said a little bit about your background, the administrations you worked for. Can you give us a kind of a brief description of your kind of diplomatic career? Like just give us a sense of what you've done.
Sure. Well, I came of age in the 70s as a high school and college student. The big issue there was Vietnam.
Mm.
And I was a normal American kid. My life's ambition until I was 13 or 14 was to play shortstop for the Boston Red Sox. And you probably recognize this. There comes a time when you know you're okay, but you're not that good. And, Vietnam just captured my imagination. Literally took down the family atlas. Where is it? When I was 13, 14, 15, came into our church, came into my hometown, protests against the war. I wrote editorials against the war as a high school student. And what that did was it kind of opened the world to me and became very interested in international politics and wanted to be an American diplomat from college on. And started in 1980. I was the lowest ranking person in the United States government in the Carter administration. I was the intern in Nouakchott, Mauritania, tiny little American embassy at the end with just two of us. And I was the second, number two guy. But what an education for me and my wife, Libby, to get to know the Arab world, to learn Arabic, to get to know a country that was extraordinarily poor and to see poverty up close and inequality up close. And so, I, like a lot of Foreign Service officers, thought I would spend my whole career in Africa and the Middle East as a French and Arabic speaker. But then I kind of wandered into Soviet affairs just as the Cold War was ending, and worked at the White House for a young um, Soviet scholar named Condoleezza Rice, who a lot of people at Stanford know. And she taught me a lot, and she and I were the two-person Soviet team advising George H.W. Bush at the end of the Cold War when the Soviet Union collapsed. And my career went in and out to places like India, where I did a lot of work, NATO, where I was ambassador on 9/11. And we should talk about allies. The allies that day, they came forward and they supported us and all went into Afghanistan with us. So a long career on several continents, three kids. My wife and Libby and I raised three kids in the Foreign Service, so they grew up overseas with us. And looking back, we've just returned a year ago from China, where I was the U.S. ambassador for 3 years. I wouldn't trade a single day of it. Fascinating career, worthwhile. I love serving our country. So that's a thumbnail sketch of, 45 years of my personal history.
Wow, that's an interesting career in life. You mentioned starting out really being captured by Vietnam. And
Yeah.
what's interesting about that, and given the current times, and you'll see where I'm going with this in a second, is there was a really strong interplay between domestic politics and international policy, right? So
Mm.
you were a part of the, at least in writing op-eds or whatever, part of the kind of the anti-war movement, I would say it sounds like. Um, and that had an influence on our international policy. So I'm curious, as a diplomat, what role do U.S. domestic politics play in your work? So you're in another country, like how much are they paying attention to the domestic politics? How are you managing the domestic politics when you're basically a diplomat for the U.S.?
It's a really good question. It's a central question. When you're representing the United States overseas or working in the State Department or the Pentagon or White House in Washington, we're a democracy. And so, you have to be transparent to the American people about what we're doing, why we're doing it. And sometimes you can make an effective case and sometimes you can't. I can tell you, just give you a couple of examples, Brian. I mentioned I was ambassador to NATO on 9/11. We were hit very hard that day. Nearly 3,000 people killed in New York City and Washington, D.C., at the Pentagon and a field in Pennsylvania. And we had an extraordinary level of support from the American public to go after Osama bin Laden and to go into Afghanistan. Now, I don't think we should have stayed 20 years, but there was public support. And I think President George W. Bush made a very effective case to the American people that we had to go to the root of the problem, which was Al Qaeda, and we had to fight it. And he had extraordinary levels of support. If you look back at public opinion polls in the autumn of 2001 for that, but he had to make the case to the public. He had to explain it because no government wants to go to war easily. I mean, quickly, excuse me. And you've got to have support in the Congress. In this case, we had bipartisan support. But I'll give you maybe another example, and that's going on right now. I'm no longer in the government. I'm a private citizen. But when President Trump threatened to attack Greenland and therefore occupy Greenland, really attack a NATO ally, Denmark, when he questioned Canada's sovereignty and said it should be the 51st state, you've seen the American public rise up. If I look at the public opinion polls, and this is Republicans and Democrats, and say, we respect Canada and we believe it's a independent state and the world should remain so, and we Americans should be respectful of that. And why would we want to go and attack a NATO member? In this case, a NATO member, Denmark, that has been an extraordinarily good, solid, and faithful ally. So you see these two examples that are very different from different times in a democracy, and this is the way it should be. You make the case to Congress if you're the president or secretary of state. You make the case to the American people. And if you don't have the people with you, it's very difficult to be effective in foreign policy.
Yeah, that raises another interesting question. How do you represent the political differences abroad? So what you're talking about is needing support at home, a base of support at home for what you're doing abroad. But there's still, because we are a democracy, there are differences where you're not going to get everyone on board. How do you represent those political differences when you're talking to someone abroad, your partners abroad?
We have a long tradition in the United States that our civil servants, our military officers, our intelligence officers, our diplomats like me are nonpartisan. And it is interesting when we take an oath, we all take an oath when we start in the government, and that oath is not to the president, whoever that person is. It's not to the Congress, it's to the Constitution. And that's a great strength of the United States that you have. In the case of a military, it's 1.5 million people. If you add the reserves, it's 2.5 million. Those of us at Treasury, Commerce, the Pentagon, civilians, State Department, we're a couple 100,000 people, perhaps in total. We all serve whatever administration and whatever president the people elect. And so in my career, as you said, Brian, I served every president from Jimmy Carter on. And some were Republicans and some were Democrats. And we never blinked an eye when we went from a Democratic president to a Republican president or vice versa, because we knew we had signed up to be nonpartisan, not to put politics into play. And I think that's a great gift that our country has, that we have so many men and women willing to do that. And it pains me now to see in over the last 13, 14 months, a politicization of our civil service and foreign service, and even of our military. It pained me to see Elon Musk and the Doge movement, who really didn't understand, most of them, they hadn't been in the federal government. They swooped in and they fired 10,000 people in USAID, the Agency for International Development, and they destroyed the agency. They actually obliterated the agency. They shut down Voice of America. They fired 3,000 people at the State Department, many of them my colleagues and friends. And, I think if you think about management, and I know that we're in a business school, Stanford Business School platform, there's a lot of fat in government and waste. And so you have to have a mindset that of reform and of cutting budgets and sometimes laying people off when it's necessary. But to come in a couple of weeks in the early part of the administration and just fire people at will and destroy agencies and not to replace them with anything, So I really hope we can return to a nonpartisan way of looking at the people who work in Washington, not to see them as the enemy or somehow not performing well. You know, you ally on reform, yes, but trust them to serve from one administration to the other, both parties. And I guess a final point on this, maybe in a more positive light, talking about this issue. When I was ambassador in China, we had a bipartisan consensus in Congress about what President Biden was doing, and it was enormously helpful to me when I was debating Taiwan or human rights issues like the rights of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang province. The Chinese were always trying to divide us politically. And I could say to my Chinese interlocutors, you know, I have Republicans as well as Democrats over both of my shoulders, and I'm speaking for them. And we're one voice to you on this issue. That was enormously helpful. And I really hope that we can retain that sense of bipartisanship on China policy, but also in general in our foreign policy.
So that's thank you for that. And I'm really curious, what happens though when there's not bipartisan support? What happens when you're the ambassador to Denmark and there's disagreement about the approach to Greenland? What happens if there's a breakdown in bipartisan consensus around China and you're the ambassador there? How do you manage those situations?
Well, you know, so the ambassador, any American ambassador to any country is the personal representative of the president to that country. And you report through the Secretary of State to the president. And so when you're an ambassador overseas, you obviously have to implement the policy of that particular president. I was ambassador for George W. Bush at NATO, and I was ambassador for Bill Clinton in China to different presidents, to different parties. But I think in the event that somehow there's a split in the United States, you have to represent your president's view, but you have to be cognizant of what the Congress thinks because they have the power of the purse. They're the ones who allocate your budget for your embassy and for whatever programs you have. And so you have to keep the lines open. And I always try to do that. I'll give you one example. When I was serving in Washington as Undersecretary of State for Secretary Condi Rice, someone I respect very, very much and is a close friend, we worked across the aisle, Secretary Rice and I, with a guy named Senator Joe Biden, who was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the second term of President George W. Bush. And we worked with him to upgrade our strategic relationship with India. And it was very important to have that Democrat, Republican, Republican, Democrat consensus on what we should do with India. So I think in all respects, even when you have a situation where one party controls the Congress, the president's in another party, you have to try to be bipartisan because it's always stronger and more effective.
One of the things that you kind of mentioned already is the change in what's in the way things are being managed now in the administration. So I'm sure every era is unique, right? So when you're in the moment, it always feels special. But by some accounts, we're currently experiencing something of a rupture with the past, right? That's the language that's been used. What feels different about the current moment to you?
You know, I always try in sessions like this to think, okay, what do I support and what do I not support? And in the case of President Trump, um, I think he was right to go for the Gaza ceasefire in the autumn of 2025 and achieve it. It was really difficult. He pushed the Israeli government harder than anyone has ever pushed them. But he also used his relationship with the Emir of Qatar and with the Saudis to have them push Hamas, excuse me, in Gaza. I thought that was a pretty good show. I also felt back in the summer, I'm a former Iran negotiator for Secretary Condi Rice, that President Trump and the Israelis were right to bomb the Iranian nuclear sites because we'd tried 20 years of diplomacy, many administrations, including President Obama and President George W. Bush, and the Iranians never took a no for an answer. Having said that, I think what I think the most serious mistake, I say this respectfully, that the Trump administration has had, and the president personally, is to disavow our allies. If you think about power in the world, whether it's measuring U.S. power versus Russia or U.S. power versus China, especially in the China relationship, if you measure our power in economic, military, technological terms, it's pretty close. But if you add to our side of the ledger our alliance with Japan and South Korea and the Philippines and Australia and Thailand, our strategic partnership with India, we are infinitely more powerful than China. China has no allies in the world. And so it's been painful to see the president putting extraordinarily high tariffs on India, Japan, South Korea at the beginning of his second term in office. But especially, I mean, just think, Brian, everything that's happened with the Europeans, the disrespectful treatment of President Zelensky, whose back is against the wall, who's the victim, not the aggressor. The fact that we've been disdainful of Denmark and of Canada, we've talked about that. No president has ever done this, and they haven't done it because one of our greatest strengths globally is the fact that we have allies that are willing to stand up for us and be with us and support us, whether it's on human rights issues or whether it's on, helping Ukraine win its war against Russian aggression. And if you disavow your allies, you're left alone. And again, I remember 9/11, and I'll tell you a story that involves Secretary Rice. I was out there in Brussels when we were hit very hard, and all the allies, led ironically by the Canadian ambassador, came to me and said, "We want to support you. We want to invoke Article 5 of the NATO treaty." That's the article that says essentially if one of us is attacked, then it shall be treated that all of us are attacked. We're all going to be together. And I figured, and we were going to vote on that the next morning, September 12th. I figured I needed the president's a concurrence with that because it was essentially NATO saying we're going into Afghanistan together after Osama bin Laden. And I called Condi Rice, and it was 4 a.m. September 12th, and she'd had no sleep, and she was in the middle of the Situation Room trying to deal with this terrible crisis that had afflicted our country. And she gave me the president's authority, speaking on his behalf, to go vote for that. And I said, "Thank you very much. I needed that. I needed that instruction from you, Condi, from the president through you. I'm going to go vote for Article 5." And she said one more thing. And I said, "What's that?" And she said, "It's good to have friends in the world." When we really needed them, they were there. And I've never forgotten Condi's words. And they're true. And they're an accurate reflection of what makes these alliances important. So I think that is the most serious mistake that's being made. And I really hope the Trump administration will reassess and fully embrace and respect these allies going forward.
Mhm. And just push back just a little bit. So there's some claims, and this is what you would argue that the Trump administration, I think, would say is that our allies haven't carried their weight, right? So this is, I mean, that's a simplified way of, I think, the argument that the administration would make, and that what they, I think, would say is they're trying to push those allies to be better friends, and maybe this is a Marco Rubio kind of point, better for themselves, better supporting their own defense, and better friends to us. What would you say in response to that?
I would say I agree with President Trump, as would George W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, Barack Obama, that the allies should be doing more. And I think President Trump deserves credit for having pushed them to spend. The NATO floor has been, you need to spend historically 2% of your gross domestic product on defense. And when I was at NATO, gosh, I think we had maybe 6 or 7 allies, including us, of course, above 2%. So it's a question of fairness. And I think President Trump deserves credit for having pushed the allies to do that. That's an accomplishment of his and of his administration. But you don't then take that and say, and because we had to push you, because they've now all committed to spend 3.5% of their GDP in defense and an additional 1.5% of GDP on infrastructure for NATO's military forces in Europe. I think you take the victory. You accomplished something and said, "Great, let's move forward together." But what's the president done? He's not been clear about whether the United States would be with the allies if one of them was attacked. We have stopped providing military aid, the United States, to Ukraine at its time of need in this war. And, threatening to attack Denmark in Greenland. I think the problem now is The problem is that the bonds of trust have been broken between the United States and our NATO allies, and we've got to repair that. And, you saw the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, give a very elegant speech, a very thoughtful speech at Davos back in January about this problem of trust being broken. And I don't think it's irretrievable. I think we can repair it, but you got to show, just like in human relations at Stanford or Harvard with people that you work with, you try to be respectful. And we have not always been respectful of the allies in the last year or so.
Yeah. So let me. You said we can repair. And I'm gonna give a less rosy vision of that and get your response. So President Trump obviously won the election this past election in a you could say resounding. You could have different views of his win, but there's no doubt that he won.
Significant victory. Yeah.
That we as a population in the U.S. are seem to be particularly polarized right now. Like the political polarization is pretty high. Um, when you are an ally and you look at the United States and you see this ability to go from one place to another quite quickly, right? So you could argue this administration has changed, and if you're a fan, has done great things really fast. If you're not, has done terrible things really quickly, but without a doubt has made changes pretty rapidly. Um, how do you regain the sense that this is a stable partner?
I think it's, Brian, the greatest challenge we face. And it's where our conversation started. You can't be effective in the world or even credible if you're disunited at home. And we've got a lot of problems. And I think the biggest problem is dysfunction in the Congress, both parties responsible for that, not just one. And these substantial divisions in American society. As recently as it may sound far away for some of the students, as recently as 9/11, our country was united, socially, politically, in the wake of 9/11. And you don't wanna have a crisis occur to make that happen again. Whether it's a Republican who succeeds, in my view, President Trump, or a Democrat, as a citizen, I want someone who will draw on, as Lincoln said, "the better angels of our nature," who will try to unite the country, and that's a hard thing to do. And there are all sorts of forces out there, including social media, that make it difficult to unite people. But we have such a great country, and, we are commemorating our 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and our freedom. This is a time for us all to reflect on how we can be better citizens and how we can treat each other with respect. One of the things that we're trying to do at Harvard, and I know you're trying to do it at Stanford too, is, we don't wanna have a faculty that all thinks alike. We're a pretty progressive faculty if you look at the faculty as a whole. And so our president, Alan Garber, has said, and I certainly agree with this, we need to bring more conservative voices, people, onto our faculty. And if we have 100 people speaking at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, where I teach, graduate school, well, a good percentage of those should be people who maybe don't agree with most of the faculty or even the students, but we're going to hear and listen respectfully to that person's point of view. I know it sounds like a Hallmark card. It's really important to do this. And to, and not just read people that you agree with, but read people maybe you disagree with so that you can challenge yourself intellectually and even spiritually. So I think all of us are responsible for trying to make this a more unified country.
Mhm. And then going back to being a diplomat, when you're in this situation, how much of a long game can you play, right? So you're representing the president. You're in essence the spokesperson for the administration, and thereby the president. You know there will be at some point there's going to be change.
Yeah.
Presumably, you care about the long term relationship. How do you deal with that when you're in a situation, especially now? For let's say you're young, you get in your first role as an ambassador today. Like how you go in, how are you thinking about managing that?
I think it's a particular problem now. We're an evenly divided country politically, and so we've been swinging back and forth between Republican and Democratic presidents. And what that means is we've had 4-year increments of one strategy, but then the strategy is completely overturned by the new president, which is his right. Contrast that with the Chinese. Now that's an authoritarian dictatorship, and they can think and plan, and they do, 10 to 15 years out. And that is an enormous advantage. Now, I would never advocate that the United States should have that type of system and have that type in order to have that type of strategic continuity. But I think in some issues we can manage it. For a long time, we really had a tradition of bipartisanship in foreign policy post World War II. Think of the containment policy towards the Soviet Union from 1947 all the way through to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. In my own career, when Condi Rice and I worked for President George H.W. Bush, Condi went back to Stanford at the end of that administration. I was a career person, and I was fortunate to stay in the White House staff, NSC, and work for Bill Clinton. There was hardly a difference between George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton on Russia policy. And there are examples of that. I think one of them, ironically enough, in terms of how Congress thinks, is NATO. Republicans firmly support NATO, as do Democrats. So we're capable of long-term policy, but it's been difficult as, the red-blue divide or the right-left divide has become more pronounced over the last 10 to 15 years since the Tea Party movement and all these very close elections. And I think we're just going to have to assume this is the case and try as much as possible to have longer-term policies. We need better infrastructure, and President Biden was able to get a $1 trillion bill passed. I really hope that President Trump will now implement it, build the high-speed rail in California, build that tunnel under the Hudson River that connects our greatest transportation hub in the country, Northeast Corridor connecting New Jersey and New York. Those are for the good of the country, no matter who's president.
And when you think about on the global stage, you mentioned Prime Minister of Canada, and he's talking about creating different kinds of alliances, right? So for like kind of the middle powers coming together, and what you see is some concern from some people in the United States of a weakening influence of the United States as people worry about the United States as a stable ally. Is that Could that be better for the world? Like, how do you envision a world in which um, allies are less certain they can depend on the U.S., form alliances, and create maybe a different pole of power in the world? How do you think about that?
Brian, that is such a good question. You and I would have to have a co-teach a course, for an entire trimester in your case, or semester in our case on that. I mean, it really is a deep subject. I teach a course called Great Power Politics,
Mm.
and Middle Power Politics at Harvard. The international system, how do we keep it functioning? I think the test here is for Americans to realize we're still the most powerful country. We're the most powerful economy. We're the most powerful high-tech sector, California, Silicon Valley, Boston, biotech. We're still militarily, number one. So we have responsibilities. And I think if we can join on some issues with the rest of the world, climate change is a very good example of that, and say, okay, we're the number 2 emitter of carbon. So we are going to dive in and contribute to the Paris Climate Change Agreement of 2015. And we're going to do our bit. Because if you don't do that, the rest of the, nearly 8 billion other people who inhabit this earth say, this is one of our biggest problems, and you are sitting it out. I hear that around the world when I travel. And there's so many other examples of that. How are we going to regulate AI? That's going to become maybe the question of the future. And if the United States sits things out and says, we're going to go it our own way, we're not going to be in the World Health Organization, we're not going to really show up at UN Security Council meetings, the rest of the world's going to say, that country's selfish. And our influence with them is going to be reduced. So like anything else in life, you've got to give a little in order to get what you want. And giving a little shows interest in the future of 8 billion people in a really complex world. And I don't think the Trump administration is at all isolationist, but it's very unilateralist. And I think we need Republican and Democrats who want to be leading in the world. Because if we absent ourselves, let's say hypothetically we did for 10 or 15 years into the future, who's going to be the dominant country? China, an authoritarian country, a Leninist political philosophy, a major human rights violator, a country that's very eager to run roughshod over its neighbors' borders. Look at the Philippines and Vietnam and South Korea and India. So I don't want to live in a world, at least my grandchildren live in a world the next 40, 50, 60 years where the United States is absent. And I don't think that will be the case. I think most Americans understand we need to be in the world. We can't just absent ourselves from it.
And, in this conversation, I have a strong sense that you have some closely held values. Um, and I think they at least are implicit in some of your answers. And I wonder, as a diplomat or someone who is speaking on behalf of someone else, how do you lead with conviction? How do you stay true to your values in the kind of context we are seeing right now, where there's deep polarization and you have responsibilities to someone else for your speech? How do you manage that?
Now that I'm an older person, when I was ambassador to China, everybody else was decades younger. And so I spent a lot of time with our younger officers talking about your question. And what I would advise them to do is say, look, we are in a hierarchical system here. We have a president who makes the decisions. We need to follow those decisions and implement them. But en route to making those decisions, we need to hear your voice inside the councils of government. If you're seeing something that you think is wrong, if we're going on any policy, in a way that you think is going to be it's going to be ineffective, you got to speak up. And if you speak up, then you have to have a sense of your own values, what you think is right and wrong, effective, ineffective. And in government, I think the people who make the strongest contributions are those people who have the courage of their convictions. And it's hard in a hierarchy. It's easier, I find, in academia. We're so flat. There really isn't much of a hierarchy. But in government, you have senior officers and mid-level officers and junior officers. And I remember being a junior officer in the 1980s, and it wouldn't have occurred to me to have told the ambassador when I was in Egypt as a 27-year-old, Mr. Ambassador, I think you're wrong about this, respectfully. But when I became an ambassador, I would tell my team, please tell me when you disagree. Another person I learned that from, I brought her up now 3 or 4 times, but she's had a major influence on my career, is Condi Rice. She actively encouraged people to disagree with her respectfully, intelligently. She wanted to hear diverse, discordant voices, because then you're a better leader. And how can you be a good leader if you're not getting the truth from the people with whom you're working?
Well, I think that's a great place to end. I really appreciate the time. Thanks, Nicholas.
Brian, it's a pleasure, and thanks for having me on this podcast. I've really enjoyed it, and all best to you and all the work you're doing at Stanford.
Thanks.